Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts. Really excited to have Rikki Herbst with us here today. I really appreciate you being here with us this morning. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Tell us, if you would, tell us a little bit about just kind of what your faith background was.
Sure. So I grew up in the Orthodox Jewish community in New York, which is like where it's very predominantly
Mm.
Orthodox in terms of where so many people are concentrated in the Orthodox community. So it's like the tri-state Orthodox.
Do you have a lot of extended family that are very involved in that faith community as well?
Yeah, I've got a lot of family like within this within New York, New Jersey, in this area.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And the Orthodox
Okay.
tend to have very big families. So family means like I'm one of six and my dad's one of five or six too. I don't even, know offhand,
Mm.
but they all have like big families. My dad's side has like probably it's like 100 grandkids at this point.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very big
Yeah.
family. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely like that's yeah, family is a big deal. Like I'm curious because just full acknowledgement, a lot of our listeners come from evangelical backgrounds. Some not all evangelical. I mean, some are like maybe former LDS, Adventist, some former Catholic as well. So certainly some of these questions I'm asking maybe like for folks who we maybe are fairly ignorant of what it is like to grow up Orthodox Jewish in the
Yeah.
US. But is it easy to leave? Is that something that is like what is that like?
The process of leaving.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I'm curious if this is similar in other faith communities. But generally speaking, growing up in the Orthodox community, everything is in the community. So
Mm.
you're educated, your work is in the like everything is so community based. Your family and it's so entrenched, and your everyday life is so embedded in the community and in just everything religious. So leaving is like uprooting your whole life, and for some, I think for some communities, it's more than others. And I think that's important to differentiate too. Orthodoxy is like a spectrum.
Mm.
So there are more like modern or moderate Orthodox people, and then there's more like ultra Orthodox people. And some of the ultra Orthodox communities live in very insulated, really, really tight knit communities. And so those are obviously much harder to leave. But I think just and I think a lot of people talk about this feeling of like almost being an immigrant, just like
Mm.
leaving and suddenly finding yourself in this other world and having to navigate that. For me personally, I think I did grow up a little bit more, I would say moderate to an extent. So I did have more
Okay.
access to like the secular world. I went to college, I had an education. So I think, and just for me personally, my personal process was to sort of like inch out slowly. And I think a lot of people tend to do that. You kind of like start making roots in other places so that when you are ready to like cut the cord, you have where to land.
Mm.
But other people are not that fortunate to have that. So I think it really varies person to person.
Yeah. Yeah. I can personally certainly relate to like having such a close knit and very insulated community. I have a unique background in Seventh Day Adventism but it's like yeah, oftentimes folks don't leave because there's nowhere to go. You don't just
Yeah.
change churches, in other words. And so it sounds like some of what you're saying, like inching out and having another community, another landing spot is important. Does sometimes you said sometimes that's not the case, like sometimes that doesn't happen. Would you say is it common for folks to just like abruptly like leave? Is that really a thing, or is it more of kind of like that inching out, like you said?
Yeah, I think it is somewhat more of a process. It's interesting because I'm doing my dissertation research on this, and that's one thing that was I interviewed 24 women,
Mm.
and whenever I asked the question of like, so when did you leave? Almost every single person had this answer, like, well, it was like X amount of years ago, but it was kind of a process. So everyone had their way of sort of
Mm.
alluding to the fact that there was some slower progression towards leaving.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing us to some of those anecdotes of like kind of like the broader picture of what folks' experiences are like. But I'm definitely curious too, like just I mean, as this part of our series is like personal stories, I'd love to hear like you specifically. When did you first begin like having questions or doubts or just inching further away?
Yeah, I feel like I started questioning things back in probably high school. And I think my high school that I went to specifically was, a religious all-girls school, and they were pretty intense about a lot of the religious stuff. So it just made me question a lot of things. And then I think also watching watching things from the out and trying to understand how men making sense of things, like how certain rabbinical leaders would do things that didn't seem right, or people who claim to be like good turned out to be pretty bad. And so
Mm,
as a as an adolescent, I think trying to make sense of that, where things that are being taught, you're being taught to be a good person, and like this right here is this whole list of all the things that are going to make you a good person, and then you're like, but wait a second, that guy is doing all those things, but he doesn't seem like a very good person. So trying to make sense of that, I think, was my first like inching inching out. And then all through my 20s, I was kind of half in, half out kind of thing, where I was still technically in the community, still kind of playing by the rules, doing all the things that were expected of me, but also kind of, and sort of not being the typical, because at that point, people get married pretty young in the Orthodox community. So being like 29 and not married was kind of a big, like, people don't know what to do with that. It's like, oh, what do we do with
yeah.
this like older single woman? As it turned out, I wasn't single. I was actually dating, sort of in the background, dating my best friend. So I was also struggling with my sexual identity, but that was a separate story. But yeah, I think where it all came to a head was actually in 2020 around the pandemic. I think a lot of
Mm,
people had their reckonings at that time. I don't know if
hmm.
that was your reckoning time, but that was when I sort of paused and realized that I was about to lose this person that I loved, and I couldn't figure out how to be who I was in the context of this community. And I had this, like, it was a real moment where I realized, like, I have this codependent relationship with the community, with Orthodoxy, with God, whatever you want to call it,
Right.
where everything that, everything was being driven by fear, shame, and guilt. Like every decision I was making, it was like that was a trifecta of who was running the show. And then I was just kind of like, wait a second, I don't want to be making decisions out of fear, shame, and guilt for the rest of my life, and certainly I don't want a relationship with religion or with a higher power or whatever to be out of fear, shame, and guilt. So that was kind of where everything really started to like unravel. Now when I really stopped observing in the way that I was.
Yeah. Yeah. Oof. That's the fear, shame, and guilt like that. Yes. I can promise you, you were very much in good company with
Yeah,
that.
I'll
Like I
bet.
know a lot of folks like that's, I hear that a lot. And the pandemic to 2020, not even just because of the pandemic, but so much that was happening just in the country. And then all of the quarantines and like the just forced shutdowns of so much of society. I know there were a lot of folks that, yeah, reckoning. That's a good word for
Yeah.
it. That's a very good word for it. Yeah,
Yeah.
like a lot of folks, I think, were able to get a little bit of separation just because they had to with the quarantines, and then a lot of folks never went back and they never quite returned, not in the way that they had pre-pandemic anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, that I think a lot of folks will resonate with that for sure. I'm interested too because I know you were saying earlier, like really large family and that being a very important piece. I'm interested to hear how does that play into the ability to leave or not? And I am asking specifically kind of in light of I know a lot of folks who leave like with evangelicalism, like and the family is still involved. Like there's a lot of pressure to not leave. Like you will be
Yeah.
possibly burning bridges with some folks if you do. And I'm just curious, is that similar with your experience or is it quite different?
So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a big thing that comes up in terms of family, because everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but many people want to maintain connections with their family in the
Mhm.
process. And that's hard to do when you're making this huge life choice that goes against everything that the rest of the family believes in. And in a lot of ways becomes threatening, right? Because like if one person sort of has this whole other life and then everybody else looks at that and is like, oh, hey, how come they can do that stuff? And
Sure.
like, and then it really challenges the belief system of this is the way to be good by following these prescribed rules. And there is my sister, my aunt, my cousin, my whatever, who is not following those rules, and they're a good person. So how do I make sense of that? So yeah, I think family is definitely a tough one for probably most people. And I think
Mm,
everybody that I know has had to make adjustments around their expectations of their family in terms of what they can expect from their family to accept versus not. That's definitely been my experience. But it definitely threw a lot of things in my family off balance because I really challenged a lot of things that were just sort of done. Like this is just what we do, and now I wasn't doing it anymore.
mm,
Um, so yeah, and then I think, and maybe this is also just an experience that people have. Like I think in the beginning, for the first couple of years, I had to really push hard and to sort of reestablish myself as the person that I was in the life that I was creating. And that was very difficult in terms of my family. But since then, I think we're sort of learning how to navigate around each other, which is probably the best that we can do at this point.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, in this, what you just were describing may have already touched on this question, but what would you say were some of the most difficult parts about just about leaving, about kind of that departure?
I think in a lot of ways, there were so many ways in which I was still rooted in the community. I was living in the place where I grew up. I was working in establishments that were part of the community. So there was this, yeah, I guess the fear, shame, and guilt kind of followed in the leaving process, because there
Mhm.
was this fear of like I'm gonna go into a grocery and I'm gonna look different and people are gonna see that and I'm gonna that and judged and talked about,
Yeah.
and then what if my work finds out? And what if my clients find out? And what if there was all this stuff that started to feel pretty scary to like make that move? So I think that was probably the hardest thing, was to really keep going, even though there were a lot of things that felt like they were at stake. I think that's what it was. It was like so much felt like it was at stake.
Yeah. And something you just said, like that, like what if work and clients find out? So even like your work was tied up in like this community. Is that
Yeah.
okay? Just make sure I
Yeah.
didn't like misunderstand. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that is a lot. I mean, so similar question, but on the flip side of that, what would you say were some of the most relieving parts, or the good parts, the less stressful parts
Yeah.
of leaving?
Getting to be myself. I mean, that's very exciting. Just having the freedom to explore in ways that I couldn't. But there's almost this like adolescent stage that happens. I'm like 30 years old and I'm suddenly like
Mm,
exploring things and getting excited by like getting to wear what I want, and kind of just getting to know myself in a way that I wasn't able to because I was sort of being stifled in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things that actually has been really nice for me is that, and I'm curious actually if this is something that other religions experience as well, because there's Orthodox Judaism, which is like sort of like a religion within Jewishness altogether. And then there's like
mm,
Jewish culture and the like Jewishness as like an ethnicity and a historical people. And for me growing up, those two were the same. Like everything, it was all tied together. And leaving kind of got me to be able to connect to my like ethnic origins and get to engage in like cultural Judaism in a way that I wasn't able to before. So now when I'm doing things that are traditionally Jewish, like I get to do them because I want to and because they are meaningful to me, because I enjoy them and because they have some value in my life in terms of like the way I connect with family and friends and with myself and my heritage and my ancestors that I didn't get in the same way. And so for me that feels really special, like getting to reclaim something that was mine that I feel like I was robbed of.
ah, yeah. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. Yeah, I will say the just the ethnic background component is certainly something that I would say is unique from a lot of the folks that come from evangelicalism like that. I mean, there may be some churches that are very tied in with like ethnic backgrounds, I'm thinking, but but probably not to that extent. And so that is really interesting. Like, and I love stuff with oriented around like values and just being able to do things because you want to do them rather than doing something because you're obligated or coerced to do it. And so I think
Yeah.
that's, yeah, like that's just so powerful in healing
Yeah.
and reclaiming your own identity, autonomy, all of the
Yeah.
things. Anyway, I'm getting into like some of like my therapy speech because anyway, I work with a lot of
From
folks
one
like,
therapist to another, I
so
get it.
yeah, and something you said earlier too, I mean, on the note of like therapy language, like it was really interesting too when you were saying about the role of family and how sometimes that can be difficult changing because again, I'm thinking now family system stuff like like in a family constellation, like in a family group, when one person does start to change, like it does demand that everyone else they have to relate to you differently or not accept the change and try to push you back to what you were like that homeostasis, return to
Yeah.
the old way of doing things. And yeah, just anyway, just thinking of all of that and just appreciating all of that. I think what you just actually described with like the ethnic background component, like that's certainly a unique piece that I would imagine most folks who come from like evangelicalism or other similar like Protestant Christian backgrounds might not relate to as much. But what are some other unique pieces that's specific to Orthodox Judaism? That what are some pieces that are unique to that background that yeah, things that you have to kind of navigate as you depart that
Yeah.
that faith background.
Well, I think, and this kind of ties it all together, maybe just understanding the history of of Judaism and the Jewish people, I think, and understanding where Orthodox Judaism even came from, because for thousands of years, Jews were just Jews. There wasn't like Orthodox Judaism versus other forms of Judaism. And then only in the last couple of hundred years, as Jewish people were sort of spread throughout Europe and the Middle East and coming to America, right? Everyone was kind of going elsewhere, and there started to become the Enlightenment, where people started to challenge some of like the traditional Jewish things. And this was a time also where, again, it feels like historically important, where for a long, long time Jewish people were confined to ghettos, and they were kind of like, you stay there and everyone else was sort of doing their own thing. And then there was this point where Jews were allowed to integrate with secular society, and so suddenly Jewish people were like exposed to the arts and music and the education that they didn't have access to beforehand. So once that kind of came in, I think that became somewhat threatening to the Jewish maybe way of life after they've been so insulated because of society. And so there were these other forms of other strains of Judaism that sort of were created through that. There was like the Reform movement, the conservative movement. And so the people who really wanted to maintain traditional Judaism kind of had to like fight hard to do so. And then it just became much more, I think it almost became so much more fear-based, because it was like, uh-oh, like we're losing it. We're losing this faith and this cultural package because people are leaving and kind of doing their own mix of it. So Orthodox Judaism as a whole only really started in the last couple of hundred years. And this is probably the most relevant to where we are right now, especially in America, which is the Holocaust
Mm.
and what that did to the community, where people after post Holocaust, it became so important to so many people to rebuild. And
Yeah.
so I think the fear factor became even more urgent. There was like this urgency around, we need to like be insulated, and we need to contain, and
Uh,
be we need to reestablish the Jewish people. And so I think, and this maybe is also a therapy speak thing, right? Like bringing in intergenerational trauma and what that does,
sure.
what it does to an individual, what it does to a family, and then what it does to these communities. It's layered in, like there's no escaping it. Like everyone has been affected by that in some way or another. And if it wasn't the Holocaust, it was uh whatever. There were post Holocaust, there was a lot of persecution in some of the Middle Eastern countries. So there was So
Yeah.
that's a whole other, Sephardic Jews have experienced that. So I think being persecuted and like annihilated really is something that underscores everything. Like that's just something that is just a very much a big part of our narrative. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very interesting piece, and it's a thing as you're describing that I'm thinking to myself like a lot of evangelicals like to think that they have this persecution thing, but it's so very interesting because clearly, I mean,
Who's killing evangelicals?
well, exactly. It's like that's such a thing, and I think when you're in it, meaning when evangelical folks were in it, I think it was harder to see. But so many of us that have now deconstructed and left, it's like it's so uncanny. It's so I don't know how to wrap my head around it. Like to identify with the oppressed when you are literally the empire, that is something that I think a lot of like evangelical folks like they could not relate to because it's like what you were saying like with the Holocaust and that's and like the intergenerational trauma and how and then of course again I know therapy speak but just understanding what that physiologically truly does and how that really does collectively live in your bodies and
Yeah.
how it's such a powerful such a real thing and but that yeah so anyway that is a very interesting distinction I'm as I'm thinking out just kind of thinking out loud but yeah, I'm interested to hear your take on this. What for you personally? What has been just kind of some of the most important pieces for you just in your healing journey?
It's a good question. I think there was a very distinct like anger stage that was pretty important. Like that being because it was years of feeling angry about things and sort of having to repress it and
Yeah,
suck it up and do them anyway. And so giving myself that space to just kind of be angry, I think that was pretty important. And then there's like there's a lot of grieving that comes along with it too. And I think that was a really important part of it. And that kind of still comes up, I think, for a lot of folks who leave, especially around like Jewish holidays, when we grew up with like the hustle and bustle of like particular holidays and what that was like. And so having that be okay and kind of leaning really into like the nuance of all of it, that it's and kind of being able to say, oh, I left this black and white world and I don't have to make it black and white right now where it's like, oh, that was bad and now it's good. And I think it's complex. That's really what it is. I think the way I grew up was complex, and I think leaving it is complex. Like there's no like pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Like we're all just living our lives trying to do the best we can and um to be happy and good people and to live according to our values and have autonomy and agency and all of
yeah,
that. So I think going through those processes and then being able to like really lean into, like I said, the reclaiming of myself as an individual, as
mm,
a woman, as a queer woman, as a Jew, and all these things, being able to like fully be in it without having to deny or suppress a part of it feels really important.
yeah. If you could speak to someone who's say like they've just left, and now I realize it's well, from what we said earlier, there's not usually a just leaving. It's kind of a slow process, but if you could speak to someone who's very early on in the journey, I'll say it that way.
Yeah.
What is one piece of advice or support that you would want to give them?
I think, the support is to get support. I always talk about this part. Like I was really fortunate to have people in my life friends who I sort of connected to people who were also in this like in between limbo space of like, are we going to be in this forever? Or are we going to make some changes? So having that support, other people who were of like, the same mindset or similar mindset, who were also on some sort of like journey to figuring themselves out, was so important and so helpful. And even now, I moved to a new area. And one of the things that's been really nice is like every time I discover, people who have, are from the community and left the community, it's
Mm,
almost like there's already so much we know about each other without having to actually know.
uh,
And so just like establishing those connections and like getting to do things together, it's really nice to be in community. And I think that's the ironic part. It's like we left this community because there were so many parts of it that weren't working, and being able to find or establish or build your own community that does work and does feel good, and you do get to be your whole self in it. That feels really
Yeah.
important. So
Yeah. No, I think that I know that the number one thing I would say, regardless of someone's specific faith background, just the biggest challenge I've heard people say that they face when leaving is feeling isolated.
yeah.
Feeling isolated, just not feeling like they have support, or feeling like that they are the only one going through it. They're going through it alone. And so I just speaking to just what you said, like that, yeah, I think that just sounds so important. So important. Being able to
Yeah.
find like-minded community. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, just to kind of go back to the idea of leaving, and I think for a lot of people, yeah, there is that process of like deconstructing almost like as you're going, but then like that moment of like leaving, of actually making that step of saying, like, telling your family or whatever it is, like, hey, I'm no longer religious. Like that part, I guess in some way does happen sort of quickly. And that part is often like the scariest part, because that's where like you're kind of exposing yourself in that way. And I think that's where having other people around you to kind of like catch you in that, because you don't know like what the level of rejection is that you're going to have or experience, so that part can be really scary. And I think there having, support and other people who can love and hold you through that is really important.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And actually, I meant to ask a little more about that. What I'm curious. What was that like for you? I mean, I know everyone's experience can be different with how their families react, but what was that process like for you?
It was a lot. I mean, I thankfully do have some family that I was able to just be completely transparent, and it was for the most part okay. And then other family that it was a lot harder with. And there was something, I think for me too, like I was always very, and this might play more into like family system stuff. So it's just in terms of like, there's the community stuff, and then there's actually the religious stuff, and then there's like the intergenerational trauma hitting the family.
Yeah,
So, so I think I always kind of held my cards close to my chest. Like there was something protective in me always to protect parts of myself. And so there was something almost exposing to suddenly be like, oh, hey, actually, I'm not all these things, and I'm actually this. That felt very vulnerable to me. Like I had to really like show up as myself in a way that I never did before. So I think that was probably like the scariest thing for me.
yeah, yeah. No, I hear that. I appreciate you sharing all of this sharing all of this. It's been so helpful. I love hearing perspectives that are just, well, like I think I said this earlier, maybe before we were recording, I don't know, but I just appreciate hearing perspectives that aren't just the kind of the mainstream evangelicalism. Nothing against those folks, of course, but like there's a
Yeah.
lot of those voices on social media, and so I always am appreciative of hearing any other stories. And
Yeah.
one question I do always like to ask folks, and that is just simply, is there anything that you wish that I had asked you, or anything like that, and throughout the course of our conversation that didn't come up that you maybe were hoping did come up that you would like to speak to?
Um, no, I think it was interesting because I was kind of coming into this with the thought that we would be talking a lot about the similarities between leaving the Orthodox community and maybe what the process is for ex-evangelicals, and then we kind of went more into the differences. So I appreciate that, because I do feel like there are a lot of nuances that are different, but I think I also want to speak to some of the experiences that might be the same, because I think that
Yeah,
that also feels important. And for me personally, part of that 2020 reckoning experience was being on TikTok and watching folks who left evangelicalism or Mormons, and being like, oh, hey, like this sounds so similar. Like something
yeah,
about these experiences feels very similar. And so for a long time, I was actually in this like, oh, we're so similar in this process. And that was actually the inspiration for my research, which was to talk about religious trauma, and looking at that and from a wider lens. Like this is not just happening for evangelicals, or just happening for Mormons, or just happening for Orthodox Jews. There's like something connecting all of us, and like what is that thing? And so I think talking about things like not having autonomy and not having agency, and things being very shame based, I think especially for women,
Yeah.
Like a lot of laws around modesty and around sexuality. And I think one of the things that I curious if this is something that is, I guess, perpetuated in evangelical communities as well. This idea that women or girls really like fear the responsibility for men's sexuality, like the idea that if a man sins or a man looks at you and has bad thoughts or whatever, it's because I was doing something wrong, like my skirt was too short or my hair was too long or something. There was always like, and that for I think a lot of women is is a big deal because like it's like everything is being you're being picked on for everything that you're doing and holding this huge responsibility to make sure that boys are not doing that and men are not doing that. And to the extent that sometimes like we get these messages that like tragedies are happening all over the world because women's fill in the blank. And I think that part feels very similar, like in terms of how women are kind of experiencing the religion and just not having autonomy around your body, I think is also probably very important. And then just some of the hypocrisy, probably, I would imagine. I know we touched on that previously
Yeah.
too. But yeah, I think those are all
Absolutely.
important too.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. Definitely the whole way that like the whole purity culture thing and evangelicalism, the way it shows up, it's did very much what you just described. Like, yeah, that's absolutely the culture of how women are treated. And yeah, it's like the whole idea of like not being a stumbling block.
Yeah, the stumbling
Um,
block. Oh gosh.
Oh, and even in the context of marriage, like in relation to between like a wife and a husband, like the emphasis on being a submissive wife, the emphasis on God doesn't desire happiness, he desires holiness, and what that entails, and how it's like showing up for your husband in a helping, subservient sort of way, is to even such an extent that then like if basically like so if he cheats and there's infidelity, well, were you showing up? Like as a wife, were you showing up? Like, and in some circles that may be stated more explicitly than others, but like it's implied even if it's not said. And so it's like that's it. Yeah, there's just so many ways like that. Yeah, culturally that is very much evangelicalism. I know that's broad strokes to just say evangelicalism because there's a lot of groups that would, but it's pretty consistent across the board, I would say. And so, unfortunately,
Yeah. And I think probably, I mean, I would imagine that because I know in the Orthodox community, like men carry a lot of shame around sexuality and just sex as a whole in their bodies. Like that, those are all things that you're kind of taught from such a young age to suppress. And so everything just is so shrouded in shame, which obviously does not create a very healthy relationship to one's body or to sex. And then things become sort of like there's this whole underworld where everything's happening in secret. And obviously things
yeah,
happening in secret are so dangerous. So that
yeah, I agree. That's another commonality there. Just the shame, just the inherent shame that just permeates conversations around sexuality and because it's a very narrow window of what is acceptable human sexual expression, right? I mean, it's like and I know that men were definitely given the program, they're given like this idea that like boys will be boys is like such a common phrase like that. Like men can't help themselves, or men are such visual creatures or whatever. There's so many
yeah.
phrases that are just used that I'm sure aren't just used by evangelicals, just used in our Western culture in general, I think. But yeah, that are absolutely it's so much of it is just steeped in shame and yeah, like secrecy and isolation definitely makes things then even it just exacerbates everything
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, and actually I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm actually curious, and maybe this is completely unrelated, but I mean I don't know. I like to see humans as like the wholeness of someone's humanity, and I know you are a therapist. I'm just so
Yeah.
curious how your background has informed your career trajectory and just kind of what you're doing now.
Yeah. So it's been interesting because I went to school for social work when I was religious. It definitely, there were just being in that environment and learning so many things outside of my religious world really like opened me up to some experiences that I think were important and informed a lot. But I think part of what was interesting has been kind of going through my own very Like it's a very distinct experience kind of going through the process while I was also a therapist, kind of working with people either very much in the community or in their own process of leaving. So I think having that parallel experience with clients is always interesting and requires lots of supervision.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think in terms of how it informs me as a therapist, I think for me, yeah, I'm very my the fundamental standing for me as a therapist is trauma. Like that is the lens in which I see pretty much everything. So looking at that for people who have experienced interpersonal trauma within their families or within religious cultural stuff. So yeah, I think it definitely deepened it and broadened it in terms of like I think people often understand trauma to be like a shock trauma or something, a specific incident that happened. And I think this has helped me understand complex trauma in a way that maybe people who haven't experienced that in the same way would. And it definitely informs so much of what I do.
Yeah. 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 I appreciate that. And yeah, just even the definition of trauma, not to get totally off on my own little soapbox. I think we're on the same page with that. Like, yeah, complex trauma is so often I think what we're dealing with both personally and professionally.
Yeah,
But yeah, I hate the DSM. Sorry, I mean, that's my whole little
I'm with
sidebar.
you.
It's such a restrictive definition of trauma, though, because I think most folks, when they think trauma, they then equate with PTSD, and then they equate with like a singular event that was
Yeah,
a horrible thing that happened, and that's the
yeah,
trauma. But complex trauma and oftentimes religious trauma seems to show up as complex trauma.
definitely,
Not
definitely.
always, but I would say most of the time. And so I think
Yeah,
that's really helpful to have that lens and be
yeah,
looking
yeah,
at it that
because
way.
it's so embedded and it's chronic, right? It's happening over a long period of time. It's developmental. It starts from when you're really young,
Yeah.
and it creates like these cognitive processes that wouldn't be there if not, right? Like all the shame-based stuff, for example, is something that just becomes entrenched in your being and can result in any open the DSM can result in pretty much anything in there. There's like I'm sure you've heard this before, like that running joke of like if we would just put complex trauma as a diagnosis, like we wouldn't need the DSM because like the DSM would be like one page.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's something, and I'm happy to see that there's more awareness of complex trauma, I think, as a whole than probably when I first came into the field. Or maybe that's just where I'm exposing myself to. Like that's the world that I know. So I think that that's what's happening. But yeah, I think it's just so important to understand it and know it and understand the mechanics of it and why it's happening. And for me, somatic work is really important in that because that to me like that explains so much, like the neuroscience behind trauma and all of that. So I guess I look at everything through that lens. Um yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate that. Well, maybe I'm in a similar circle. I don't know. I agree. I've seen that trend as well. Like people being more open to seeing things through a trauma lens than what I think maybe they were 15 years ago, 10, 20 years ago. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely shifting more and more. And I had a similar anecdote from a professor. I think it was anyway, someone with a PhD in clinical psychology, basically saying, well, yeah, if they were to expand the definition of trauma, then everybody would have that diagnosis, which yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, that's a pretty damning statement. I mean, it's like, yeah, like that just shows how prevalent it is, but how restrictive the definition is. And so yeah. And I appreciate just taking into account like body based stuff because like it does so live and exist and show up like in folks' bodies, and, um, and
Yeah.
so I appreciate that. I do a lot of similar backgrounds, similar stuff like somatic based stuff. And so
Yeah.
I so appreciate you coming on today. I don't want to take too much of your time. I mean, obviously, as a therapist too, I know I could just chat about these things for hours. But
Yeah, same.
I so appreciate you taking the time out of your morning to chat with us and just share your background, personally, professionally, all of the things. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.